they began to develop this language through the Juventud Peronista. And you have to remember that Peronism, even during the time of Perón's government, there was some very sort of seriously socialist. But there was a very famous one called John William Cook, and there's 2 volumes of letters between him and Perón, and he would have been a perfectly good Euro-communist. You know, he'd have been perfectly happy within the Manifesto group in Italy, or he was a very European socialist figure. The Montoneros were inserted in that way, and they then linked up. They did not mobilize the masses in the way the Juventud Peronista did. The Juventud Peronista were incorporating school children, secondary school, university students. Everybody could get into and become a militant of the Juventud Peronista, which meant that once the opening came after the fall of the military in 1972, and they had open elections, won overwhelmingly by Campora, suddenly the Montoneros became a mass movement, with some fairly serious characters from the FAR, who were the more conventionally Guevarista guerrilla. But even again, within that, there were plenty of seeds of ideological conflict.
What was its leader, Mario Firmenich, like?
I was part of a group that opposed Firmenich in 1978, when Firmenich was trying to persuade people in Europe, refugees, to go back to Argentina.
To take up arms.
To take up arms again and to renew the struggle at a time when he must have known.
Yes, but it was all over.
That it was all over and that they were going back to a certain death. So the question is, A, why did he do that? And some people will tell you that Firmenich was compromised with the services, in the intelligence services in Argentina, well before that.
Right.
And that for whatever reason, whether through opportunism or deeper political reasons, Firmenich had changed sides.
Yeah.
Now,
what was he though before he changed sides? Let's start with the man who enters the stage.
Well, he was again. I mean, I met Firmenich several times, but a lot of my information about Firmenich, you have to understand.
Second-hand.
Not only second-hand, comes from his enemies.
Yes. So what I'm asking is, what was your impressions of him?
Well, he really believed that the military could be split again, that the strategy of the Montoneros in those years post the military coup, which came, I think I'm right in saying, in March '76, when Videla took over, and at that time, when things were already pretty shaky, but you have to remember that the Montoneros had been able to act with a considerable degree of impunity. They were very well structured and based, and although they were losing people, nothing like the way things began to go wrong in 1977 and post the military coup, when things tightened up.
So at that stage he was seeking to persuade a part of the military to peel away as part of a kind of
there were differences within the army. I believe the best book is by a man called Miguel Bonasso. The Navy, there is quite a lot of evidence that Massera believed he could sort of create that he could break away and become an elected president, that he could become a sort of substitute Perón. And I think this is nuts.
Yes.
But that was the belief.
That was the sort of phantasm
that was the fantasy. And there were people in the army, there undoubtedly were splits. I mean, after all, the Argentine military went through 3 different presidents between 1966, when Onganir took over, he was replaced by Livingston, then he was replaced by Lanusse, who then was booted into the dustbin of history in 1972. So it's not entirely, and there had been times previously when the Argentine army had been sort of bombing one another. So there were good precedents for splitting the military. It wasn't a silly idea. And undoubtedly there were negotiations with segments of the armed forces. However, and that was clearly to Firmenich's taste. I mean, the Montoneros, which is where he came from, and the Montoneros had huge prestige from the armed actions they had undertaken, and that the fact that they had been daring enough to publicly go into armed struggle on behalf of the... So they had a certain prestige within the coalition, but they were very much conspiratorially minded. Several of them did come from... I'm not sure that Firmenich did. I've been struggling to think of this, and I'm not the person to ask. But certainly Galimberti, who was another of his close associates, but who then split off from him, came from the Tacuara, which was a near-fascist wing of the Peronists. I mean, they espoused very much a kind of nationalist, militarist...
So on the spectrum, they sort of shaded towards...
on the right wing.
Yeah.
And actually Galimberti moved again sharply to the right after the end of the military dictatorship.
And how did this organisation finance itself?
Well, in a variety of different ways. Quite a lot of kidnappings. I mean, the biggest one obviously was the Bourne brothers, where they took what I think remains one of the largest ransoms ever paid of 70 million. If you think $70 million in 1973 or 74 was a fantastic ransom. And probably it was only after that they began to need a lot of money. I think there were people within the Peronist movement who saw, and I'm sure Perón was funneling funds from he had very wealthy supporters in Argentina and Spain, and I'm sure they were getting money from that source. So the funding question became a big issue after, I mean,
presumably after they scaled up militarily.
In the early days, they did a variety, I mean, they burgled banks, bank robberies, expropriations, as they were called.
But if you're a guerrilla movement like the Montoneros and you take $70 million off of somebody, what do you do with it?
Very, very difficult. The Montoneros did two things with it. I mean, I'm sure small amounts went in other places. There was an Argentine banker called David Graeber who offered to help them deposit half of it in a bank in Switzerland, and he organised that, and if Galimberti is to be believed, in conjunction with the Israeli...
With Mossad.
With Mossad directly. And that they were taken to a bank in Switzerland, and the money which had been flown in Graeber's private jet was deposited in the presence of Galimberti and one or two others.
And why would David Graeber, as a banker, do this?
He might have thought they were going to win at that time. Graeber had made a lot of money through his association with the government at the time of Campra. I think he had been the banker to the Montoneros for some time. He may have had an ideological sympathy with them. He was Jewish. The left in Argentina was quite heavily Jewish. There were lots of links between Argentina and Israel, the Jewish community, and the Jewish community in Argentina has always been quite nervous because of anti-Semitism within the armed forces. And then Graeber very conveniently disappeared. I can't tell you the exact year, but he took off from the United States, and his plane was blown up over Mexico. But it is widely believed that Graeber was not in the plane when it blew up And certainly many people in Argentina believe that he's still living comfortably off the born ransom in Israel. The other half went to Cuba.
Yeah.
The Cubans looked after the other half, and I imagine that has vanished as well.
Yeah.
Or into the Cuban treasury.
Yeah.
Certainly the Montoneros did not stay in possession
of the money.
Well, I'm sure they had some of it.
Yes.
But the bulk of it went to Cuba and Israel.
Yeah. So, what happened in terms of targeting people in the military campaign? Because it seems to have been everybody from conscripts at one end to these fabulously rich industrialists.
Well, there were some things that were done against the military. I mean, there were assassinations of leading military. There were assassinations of people who, and this led to a huge. Again, I can't remember his name now. If we went back over it, there was one particular trade union leader who was shot because they thought he was a collaborator with the military, and this was hugely criticised from within the Peronist movement and from within the armed resistance. People were, there was a plane, a very famous case where a plane was blown up flying into Tucumán. I think as much as the individuals, there was a belief that the military would become, it would foster the splits and the lack of confidence within the military. That the Montoneros believed their capacity to undertake these sort of spectacular acts of assassination or military assassination, and they probably overestimated all of that. Going back to the funding thing, there was a sort of whole network of sort of robbing cars and stealing cars and robbing banks that were it was quite significant.
A sort of logistics operation.
It's a logistics operation, they also quite amusingly had some of their younger members going around collecting the change that they needed, because all their communications had to be through public telephone boxes.
Right.
So you spent your life ringing in public telephone, one public telephone box from another public telephone box, so that the telephone calls could not be traced or tapped. And so the collection of change became quite a large
part of that activity,
logistical operation.
How did the
I think the selection of targets was probably partly tactical, because obviously, although the Montoneros were essentially directed, there was also a huge amount of local autonomy with different groups working. So things would happen that would be decided by, for instance, a group in Misiones.
Yes.
With no reference to what happened in Buenos Aires. Because there would not be constant.
There is not a command structure.
There's not well, there was a command structure, but it was very incredibly loose. And often there were people popping up with different ideas in different parts.